Welcome back to the channel. This is the third video in a series of 3 videos. This video we're going to go over installing the main rotor hub shaft or the mast into the transmission of an EC135 helicopter. The other 2 videos, one was removing the mast, the other video was inspecting the spacer tube. And this is the third and final video in this series. I'm sorry this is going to be a long video and it has a ton of detail, and I'm going to just talk a whole bunch, and it's going to be very boring, and you're going to be drinking from the fire hose. I'm sorry, but there's going to be a lot of good information here.
You're a lucky little boy, because you know why? You get to drink from the fire hose! Okay, you ready? Yeah! Open wide!
Aircraft Maintenance Manual, AMM 623100 4-4. There are a lot of references. See all these references here? And when you go to those references, the other chapters in the maintenance manual, they're going to send you somewhere else as well. So if you go to this section, the one for installing the main rotor hub shaft, the mast, it doesn't tell you to add oil. That's on a different section, installing the lower cover to the transmission. Anyway, we're going to go over all these things. All right, before we begin, a quick disclaimer. I'm not affiliated with any aircraft manufacturers. I make these videos for entertainment, not education. Always refer to the manufacturer's maintenance instructions and not this video or any other videos on this channel. If there is something said in this video that is contrary to the maintenance manual, defer to the maintenance manual. Maintenance manuals are being revised all the time. Check current revisions prior to completing any maintenance on your aircraft. That being said, thank you for watching and let's roll. All right, let's dive right in. If you remember previously, they had you install the groove nut onto the lower collector shaft inside the transmission. And if you haven't done that in the past, do that now. Next, check whether the solid film lubricant layer on the outer splines of the mast is worn. If necessary, touch up the solid film layer. Next, figure out what kind of oil you have in your transmission and put some oil on the splines of the mast. Next, coat a new O-ring with assembly fluid, CM772, which is Ultra Chem assembly fluid number 1. You have to have this. If you don't, that O-ring is not going to stay in there. This stuff is super sticky, and it keeps the O-ring in that groove. And since that groove isn't a big circle, it's a weird shape, it keeps it in there way better than anything else I've tried to use. While you're doing this, grab another O-ring, the same O-ring, and put it around the mast and put it on the other side of the support tube, the swash plate support tube. So when you're all done and you put this thing all together, if that O-ring leaks or got pinched somehow, you'll have an extra O-ring. All you have to do is lift up the support tube and put the new O-ring in there and remove the old one. Apply a thin layer of grease, CM101, to the sealing lip of the shaft seal in the support tube and to the contact surface for the shaft seal on the ring. So put grease on the lip of the seal and on this ring. All right, get a couple people, put some gloves on, pick up the mast and stand it right side up and make sure it doesn't fall down and make sure it's setting on something nice and soft, and then put the flower pot back on and then hook up the lifting eye and the crane or the hoist or however you're going to lift this thing up. Put a big zip tie around the rollers of the mast bearing and make sure you push all those rollers in and cover it with oil. It doesn't tell you to do that, but nothing wrong with putting oil on it. But make sure those rollers are pushed in. None of them are stuck out at all. If they're stuck out at all, when you drop this into the top of the transmission, it will catch on the outer race of the bearing and it will wreck the brass. It will wreck the brass carrier there. Or I've heard a guy say that one of those rollers just exploded on him. So be careful. Wear safety glasses when you're doing this. Okay, next thing they want you to do is they want you to warm up the transmission pretty hot. Make sure that the temperature of the splines of the collector shaft is between 100 degrees and 110 degrees Celsius. That's pretty hot. So set up a heat gun that's blowing heat into the bottom of this transmission. And put a cut, like if you have a piece of sheet metal, cover up the top of the transmission so all the heat doesn't come out, and just leave it there for a while until the outside of the transmission is pretty hot. If this is hot enough, then the mast just drops in. All right, next thing it says, using a crane, lifting the mast and slowly lower it into the top of the transmission. While doing so, ensure that the spacer tube does not fall down. Okay. And that the splines of the main rotor shaft fully engage the splines of the collector shaft in the transmission. If you need to, you can rotate this. You can rotate the mast, like grab the upper part of the mast flange, and you could rotate it a little bit until the splines line up, and then it just drops in. But just make sure that those rollers on that bearing don't catch on the outer race. And when it's sliding down into the transmission, the tolerance is really close so that the zip tie will get pushed up and out. It won't get jammed up in there, okay? It'll get pushed out. Just make sure you cut that zip tie and pull it out of there when you're done. That's in the manual too. Okay, we're going to deviate from the manual just a little bit, but we're going to go through the manual. At this point, if you check dimension X and it is what it was when you removed it, or it was within the tolerances that it says, we'll go through that later. I don't see why you would have to do this next step. But this next step is Airbus wants you to squeeze this whole thing together. Airbus wants you to use this thing called the pre-tensioning device, which squeezes the mast into the collector shaft of the transmission, like a lot of force. So the pre-tensioning device are these things that are marked in orange, and all these things marked in green in your kit, except for maybe not one of those. Anyway, you have to put it all together from the top down. And before you hook up all the stuff on the bottom, it says remove the groove nut, the one that you just put on. The reason that was there, according to Airbus, is so that your inner race of your collector shaft bearing does not fall out while you're putting the mast in. I've never seen that happen, but like I said previously, don't be the guy who has to call your boss and say that you broke the transmission because you didn't use the correct tool, okay? At this point, remove the groove nut. You need to look at the drawing and make sure everything's hooked up correctly, but it's not super confusing. Just make sure you have all the right parts pushing on the right parts inside the transmission. Connect the hydraulic hand pump with the hose to the hydraulic cylinder. It says generate a pressure of 3,770 psi with the hydraulic hand pump and maintain for at least 5 seconds. It's a decent amount of pressure. Slowly release the hydraulic pressure. All right, remove the pre-tensioning bolt from the main rotor hub shaft, pre-tensioning device. Now they want you to check dimension X, like we talked about before. That's between from the lower edge of the mast or the main rotor hub shaft to the lower edge of the collector shaft. All right, when checking dimension X, it says if you're using the same mast and the same spacer tube, and the same ones are going to be reinstalled, it says compare the dimension that you had before you removed it, and it should be equal or greater than what you had. If not, then something's not installed correctly. Like maybe that ring didn't get pushed all the way down during your reinstallation of the mast. Then it says, if not the same mast and the same spacer tube are to be reinstalled, the clearance of dimension X should be between 13.9 millimeters and 14.9 millimeters. If it's not in this range, then something's wrong. All right, now we're moving along. It says if this O-ring isn't in the right spot on the swash plate support tube, it's going to leak, obviously. So before you slide that support tube down onto the top of the transmission, check with a mirror and make sure that the O-ring is in there. Of course, this picture isn't right. This picture is before installation. So you'll maybe have like an inch of clearance to look up inside of there from underneath. Also check to see if the spiral ring is in the groove of the seal. If that pops out, your seal is not going to seal. Look with a mirror, double check that that spring is where it's supposed to be inside of that seal. Carefully lower the support tube onto the ring which is on the mast, right? So the shaft seal has to go around that ring. So you could move that thing around, like twist it around a little bit so that the lip of the seal goes around that ring. Remember, that should have been coated with grease, so it should slide down pretty easily. Next, it says attach the support tube and the accelerometer bracket to the transmission, and just make sure that that accelerometer bracket, the part with the angle, points down. If it points up, it could interfere with your flight controls. So it's kind of a big deal. All right, moving along. Ensure that the threads on the very bottom of the mast are clean and free of dirt. It specifically says that. Hopefully you would have cleaned it before you dropped it in there. and put oil on it. It doesn't ever tell you to put oil on it, but you should, because you got to put oil on the mast nut. Anyway, make sure it's clean. If you need to clean it with whatever they call here, CM202 dry cleaning solvent. Let it dry. Next thing we're going to do is install the mast nut, the main rotor hub shaft nut, and that's a different chapter, and we're going to go into that with a lot of detail. This is AMM 6231004-8 mast nut install. Well, there's two different types of mast nuts. The type we have here is the mast nut with the pre-tensioning bolts. That's the newest style mast nut. There's also the lower seal, open retaining ring, closed retaining ring, with the seal, without the seal. There's like 6 different versions. Anyway, we're going to go step by step with what we have. This is the new style mast nut with the pre-tensioning bolts. It says, remove the pre-tensioning bolts from the nut. Clean the threads of the nut and the threads of the pre-tensioning bolts with CM202 and let it dry. Then it says, figure out what kind of oil you have in your transmission. Hopefully you know, because you can't mix them. They want you to apply transmission oil onto the threads of the nut and the threads of the pre-tensioning bolts. Then install the pre-tensioning bolts, but just thread them down, but don't thread them through the nut. Thread them like 90% of the way through. Don't let them protrude out the other side. And then clean the top, the heads of those bolts, and mark them 1 through 12 in a circle clockwise. Okay, and then they want you to apply oil, transmission oil to the ring. They want you to install the ring and install the nut onto the bottom of the mast. And then it says, tighten the nut. So that big thing with the pre-tensioning bolts, just thread that on. Don't get crazy. Just thread it until it makes contact and it's somewhat tight. But when you go torque these, they're going to allow you to loosen it up a little bit if you need to line up everything, the retaining ring. Okay, so if we scroll down, effectivity, closed retaining ring, post-service bulletin, EC135 63016 on this part of the maintenance manual. This is variant 3, closed retaining ring, and the service bulletin is the mast, the seal that goes onto the retaining ring. So the retaining ring is assembly. We went over this in the previous video. It's got the retaining ring, the bolt locking washer, and the rotor ring for the mast moment indication, and it also has this lower seal bolted to it. So it says install the retaining ring assembly to get, okay, look, we're going to install this just to make sure it lines up. Then we're going to take it off, and then we're going to torque these bolts. So no worries. So you got the mast nut threaded on. Put the retaining ring up there. You know, you're going to need to drop a string down the mast and pull up the cable for the mast moment wire, and then put the retaining ring assembly up there and try to line it up with the threads of the mast and pick up the 3 holes that line up the mast that this bolts to. So if it doesn't fit, you could pop it out and turn it 120 degrees. You have 3 tries to line it up. Figure out which one is the closest. It says there's a huge caution, okay? You're allowed to back up the mast nut 10 degrees. If you go more than 10 degrees, you're going to damage stuff. And considering this is probably the most critical part on the helicopter, follow that rule. I've seen it line up most of the time without loosening it up, which is pretty cool. Anyway, put the retaining ring assembly up in there. Align the attachment bore holes of the nut with the attachment bore holes of the retaining ring. If you cannot fully align them, turn the nut counterclockwise. That means loosening the nut a maximum of 10 degrees. And I would put the 3 bolts in that attach it, just thread them in by hand, just to make sure they're lined up, because it will look lined up, but it won't be. And then later on, you'll be pissed off because you have to do all this again. Anyway, while that's in there, reach over the retaining ring and use your fingers to tighten the pre-tensioning bolts, those 12 bolts, just so that the nut doesn't move when you take the retaining ring assembly back off, so that you could torque these bolts, if that makes sense. I know this is a lot of words and I'm blah, blah, blahing you, but hopefully it's a little bit clearer. The pre-tensioning bolts are snugged up with your fingers. Now you could remove the retaining ring assembly, remove it with the mast seal at the same time, because it's a big assembly. Now this is effectivity of all, and this is how you tighten. This is how you torque the pre-tensioning bolts of the mast nut. Torquing the pre-tensioning bolts has a specific sequence, and it's like 2 pages in the maintenance manual. You have to follow it correctly. If you just look at the figure and you see the torque, and it's 47 to 48 inch-pounds, and you're like, oh, I'm just going to torque this to 48 inch-pounds, you're going to screw stuff up. That would be very bad. That's super incorrect. And like I said, this is probably the most critical part on the helicopter, so it has to be done correctly. And we're going to go over that now. It's not a big deal, but we're just going to make sure that it's stated the proper process on how to torque this mast nut. It's June 2024. It could be revised tomorrow. Read the manual. Don't rely on the video. This is just a refresher for reference. Next, it says, torque tighten the pre-tensioning bolts in the sequence 1, 8, 5, 12, 4, 9, 2, 10, 3, 7, 6, 11. After that, after you torqued it to 27, you change your torque wrench to 48 inch-pounds, between 47 and 48 inch-pounds, and you torque it in the same sequence. 1, 8, 5, 12, 4, 9, 2, 10, 3, 7, 6, 11. Cool. Third step, same torque, 48 inch-pounds, and you torque it 1 through 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12.
Oh, you can count. Good for you.
And you can count on me waiting for you in the parking lot.
Next step, 4. Well, number 4 is repeating forever until it doesn't spin, all right? Apply the torque again at 48 inch-pounds in a sequence 1 through 12 until you cannot turn the bolts, okay? Because you'll have one that'll turn, one that will just move a little tiny bit each time you go around or whatever, so you end up going around like 4, 5, 6 times originally. On the retorque, I think I went around like 3 or 4 times just to make sure it was torqued. But there's a note here. It says you can use your finger to make sure that the bolts do not turn when you torque them. Okay, thanks for that. And here's effectively closed retaining ring. What do we do next? Put the retaining ring assembly and the main rotor hub shaft seal, because they're together, into the mast, the main rotor hub shaft. So you push it up there, and you need to make sure it goes the right way. You could rotate it 120 degrees. There's 3 different positions it'll fit in, but one of them will line up your holes, your bolt holes. And then once you get it lined up right, just pop it in there. The seal will fit in there nice and easy. There's a groove. It says make sure that the sealing lip of the seal engages the groove in the mast. Not complicated. Then it says attach the retaining ring to the nut with the screws 9 and torque them to 40 to 48 inch-pounds. Next, tighten the 3 nuts for the main rotor hub shaft seal, the seal nuts, until you can see 2 threads, all right? And this is for closed retaining ring, and you have to make sure you have the stack up correct. I've done this job, and I've seen the stack up done wrong. Anyway, you have to make sure the stack up is correct. If you have the closed retaining ring, you don't need this 1 spacer sheet. Okay, if you have the closed retaining ring and the spacer sheet and you have 2 threads or 3 threads, it's too much, because you have too much torque on the bolts inside the seal, and you're going to wreck them. And then you're going to be the next guy who tries to loosen it up, and you can't, and you end up breaking the freaking bolt off of the rubber. All right, this is exciting.
I like this ship. You know, it's exciting.
Next, the mast moment wires at the top of the mast, plug them into the hubcap support. So you're going to have to uninstall that again, pop it out, make sure it has a new O-ring, and check the EMC gasket there. I'll put all the part numbers in the description for everything of this video. Anyway, plug in those cables, and there's a zip tie inside the mast that you zip tie that one wire to, or both the wires. I can't remember. It's hard to tell in this picture. Okay, we're still in the mast installation section. It says install the lower transmission cover. This is maintenance manual AMM 6321000413. We're going to go there next. All right, installing the lower cover for the transmission. Follow this section. It gives you the torques. It tells you where to put Mastinox. You need a giant O-ring. Don't start this job without it. Maybe you have 2 just in case. But in this section, it gives you a reference for installing the Y strut, and then it tells you to put oil into the transmission, service the transmission with oil. This is the only section where it tells you to do that. Don't forget to do that. We're going to talk about that at the end for a reminder again. I mean, don't be that guy. I've never done that. Knock on wood. Yeah, it's all done, except we don't have oil in the transmission. Whoops. Okay, so at this point, put the cover on, plug in the mast moment wire, bolt up the cover, and add some oil to the transmission. I'd service it now. Check for leaks, and then top it off. And then They want you to do this later on, but I recommend doing it now before everything's hooked up. You may even do it before you add oil to the transmission, but it says do a functional test of the mass moment system. There's 2 different sections, okay? One is do a check of the mass moment indication, and the first one is do a functional test of the mass moment system. This has you power up the helicopter, make sure that the mass moment indication is there and it's not yellow, it's white with an MM, and then there's a white arrow that's not indicating any mass moment deflection. Also, if you go to this section, they want you to do a couple other things. They want you to drop the Pelican rack in the back. We have Euro 5 is what it's called. The maintenance manual only talks about Euro 2, 3, and 4. So I don't know what's up with that, but anyway, it's the same. I think Euro 4 and 5 are the same. So if you drop the Pelican rack and you look in the back, there's this box, and it's supposed to have a yellow light that says power okay. If it's red on the right side where it says signal fault, that means you have a problem. But it probably wouldn't show you everything's okay on the front. They also want you to take this cover off of the right side of the box. There's a test plug there, and they want you to check for voltage at a couple of the pins there. So have fun with that. That's a functional test of the mass moment system. Okay, now back in the maintenance manual for installing the mast. This also tells you to install the lower transmission cover. That's what we just did. And fully install the flower pot, the hubcap support on the top. Just go ahead and do that now. It's probably a great time. And finish installing the lower cover, which is the Y strut. And on that Y strut on the outboard connection, it says to tighten, it says to torque the nuts on those 2 bolts. And it just says ensure that there's no axial play. So it doesn't give you an actual torque. It just tells you that there's no forward and aft movement. It's not loose. So don't gorilla torque it. Again, make sure you have oil in your transmission. Top it off. If you only put 2 quarts in previously, check for leaks. Go ahead and top it off. All right, now the lower cover's installed. Have somebody eyeball in there. And before you put the cover on, have somebody eyeball or double check your mast nut installation and make sure there's nothing crazy going on up in there. Like, you have guys here to help you, so don't just do it on your own. Once the lower cover's on there and someone looks at it, go ahead and cover it up, put that lower fairing on there, or whatever they call it. All right, now we're really back in the manual for the installation of the mast. I'm on paragraph E21, and it says, fix the hinge support to the bearing block using attachment hardware. It references a totally different chapter. That's these bolts right here. Make sure when you're reading the manual and you're going through it, have it printed out and check the boxes while you go through it. Like we just did. It says fix the hinge support to the bearing block using attachment hardware with that reference. Have that reference printed out. Go to it and go to the parts that are required and check that box so you know it's done. Because there's like 50 things we're doing right now, and you're going to have like 2 or 3 dudes working with you, and you want to make sure everything gets hooked up correctly. You don't want to leave anything unfinished. Okay, next, attach the connecting rods to the fork lever and the cyclic lever of the mixing lever gear unit. Then that's another chapter. So go there and just do the parts that they're talking about, which are the 3 connecting rods that go to the front of your mixing lever gear unit. Hook those up. So when you're connecting the 3 rods, before you cut the zip ties that are holding the top of your swash plate up, put this fixation clamp on there. And this would be in the chapter for attaching the connecting rods to the fork lever. So don't forget to put that on there. And you might hold the fork lever down, which lifts up the swash plate, so that you could put this tool in there. And then you can cut the zip ties, and then you can lower it down onto here. Otherwise, your sliding sleeve of your swash plate is going to smash your swash plate support, and then you're going to be screwed because it'll have a big dent in it, and you're going to need to replace that. And people are going to get mad. All right. Anyway, moving on. It says install protective cap to the main rotor hub shaft. There's like 2 big paragraphs talking about how this goes on here. So you clamp that plastic protective cap onto there in a specific location, and that rotates with the mast, but the part right underneath that does not rotate. That is the the top of the swash plate support. So there has to be a gap there. Otherwise, it's going to touch that and it's going to make a huge, it's going to break stuff. It's just going to be contacting it. And that's not what you want. So make sure it's in the right spot. They also want you to seal the top with whacker. They also want you to put safety lacquer onto the clamp screw. Okay? Not complicated. Just make sure you follow the directions. And that's in the installation of the manual. I mean, that's in the manual for the installation of the mast. All right, next, chapter E24. Install the scissor assembly to the connecting parts of the main rotor hub shaft. Those are both of your drive links. It says do not attach the helical lever, that's the bottom part, until after the installation of the pitch control rods for the main rotor blades. Otherwise, you can't put the bolt in for the lower PC connection. So just install the top part of that drive link and then just temporarily install the bottom part. Just, run those nuts down hand tight. But when you're done putting the main rotor blades on and the PC links on, make sure you go back and you tighten up and cotter pin the lower connection of the drive links. That's something you could forget. Don't forget. All right. Now it says effectivity all. It says install hubcap support. We already did that. Oh man, we're almost done. Wow.
Are you kids having a good time? Hey, how about that cartoon? That was a weird cartoon, wasn't it?
Again, it says to check the functioning of the mass moment indication. We already did that because we wanted to know if it was good before we finished everything. Now it says install the main rotor blades and install the transmission fairings. So everything should be hooked up now. One last thing that I don't remember the maintenance manual talking about installing is the Meg pickup on the back of the swash plate inner ring. Don't forget that. And the last thing on the list is to check the mass moment indication. And that's in the MSM 056000. This is the one where you have to do the ground run and it makes sure that the mass moment system sensitivity is correct. And I'll make a video on that one later on, but you run it up and you bump the cyclic stick forward to certain spots, and then you have to check certain measurements to make sure when you move the cyclic a certain point, it moves the indication of the correct amount on the indication. Okay, not complicated, but when you read that procedure, it's not easy. And this reference right here, 560006-1, that's the whole ground run and functional check flight. Okay, the only part you're doing in there is just the mass moment on the ground. To be honest, that's it. And then you go do a functional check flight and make sure everything's good and make sure there's no leaks. Well, do your ground run, do your mass moment check. If there's no leaks, you could take that O-ring off, that extra one that's on your support tube. Take that off, throw it out, throw it in the trash, cut it off. That's it. I am excited. This is done. This job is done. This was a huge job. It took days to do. This video took like a year to make because I'm not very efficient. So,
hey, you really went beyond the call of duty on this one, pal. Thanks.
I'm glad to have been of service, George. Well, it appears my work on this planet is complete. I must now return to my home on the planet Zarkon.
Okay, well, have fun.
Hey, nice going, kid. I didn't know you had it in you. You're okay.
Thanks, Uncle Harvey. Have a nice flight back to the coast.
Thanks.
Say hi to Aunt Esther for me.
Oh, yeah.
I hope that you guys got something out of this video. If you know anybody who might be interested in watching this, send it their way. Send them a link to the video. And I appreciate you guys tuning into the channel. Thanks. And I'll see you guys on the next one. Later.